Thank you very much, Hedy. Welcome to Gallery Teachers Masterclass once again. Thank you very much for joining me and the whole team for our workshop on pronunciation teaching. Steve, thank you very much for agreeing to be my panelist. I would like to start off by asking if any of you would like to post any of the takeaways from the session in the chat box. So you can do that during our discussion, or you can perhaps raise your hand and then talk about it. I was following the discussion and taking part in the discussion in the chat box during the input session, and there were a couple of things that came up in that discussion. So perhaps these things could be the starting point for our discussion. Is there anything that you would like to pick up on, Steve, to start off?
Oh, yeah, hi. Yes, a couple of things. One of them is I wondered why you don't touch on any of the psychological aspects of pronunciation learning. I mean, I'm thinking about Guyora's 1972 ego permeability, for example, but also, you know, things like speech accommodation theory, phonological avoidance in particular, because I do think that, you know, one can learn pronunciation, but actually using it in a real situation basically, I think that we're reduced to children, aren't we? Low-level learners are reduced to a childlike status, and I wondered what your thoughts on that were. That's
Okay, thank you very much for that, Steve. One of the main reasons why I didn't touch on that was that, unfortunately, our time is limited. So, pronunciation is such a huge topic. And it's kind of difficult to touch on everything. So I had to, before I actually prepared the input session, I had to sit down and think really hard what it is that I want to include and what are the things that I want to exclude. I'm not sure about learners being reduced to being like children. I think I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that. I think if you mean by that they don't really have a whole range of language tools at their disposal, like children, because children are still learning a language, then yes. But if this is the case, which it obviously is, then I think it's extremely important to include pronunciation teaching or pronunciation focus right from the start, because pronunciation is a language system like any other system. And so because of that, if we want to give our students a whole range of tools, or a complete range of tools, of language tools to use as early as possible, then obviously pronunciation is going to be part of that pack, if you like. I think in terms of psychological difficulties, I think because it's a huge topic, I don't really want to start, we don't really have that much time to talk about it, I think. So I don't really want to start a whole discussion of that. But is there any particular aspect of that that you wanted to pick up
on? I have dealings here here in southern Italy with a lot of British people who've been living here for many years. So this is outside of my teaching, really, but it's something I've been mulling over recently. And some of these people are middle-aged and experienced and professional people, and they can't get their heads around the fact that in order to function here, they're definitely reduced. There's no question in my mind. They're reduced by their own inability, but they're also reduced by their interlocutor. So I took somebody to a police station not long ago, and to help him explain that his neighbor was making a lot of noise at night. And the police officer was very friendly and very kind, but treated him like a child, and indeed spoke to me about him rather than trying to speak to him. And so this is, for me, I mean, I completely and absolutely agree with you that pronunciation is key. but I do think that and I also recognize that in the short time that you have available, it's not possible to cover everything. But I do think that this is a major area. When you pronounce a foreign language, you move into a different sphere. Your brain moves into a different sphere. You become, I believe, a different personality, actually. And I think that the literature and indeed I don't think we've coped with that very well at all over our history as teachers. I don't think we've recognized that well enough. So it comes back really to Krashen and the affective filter, and all of that stuff. So yes, that's really what I was aiming at. Sorry if it took you off track.
No. I mean, any avenue is open to be pursued. I think this is actually a very important point. And the fact that people who don't have teaching background sometimes forget, and unfortunately sometimes it's also some teachers, and luckily it's only some teachers, who forget that a learner whose English is at a very low level has not lost their intellectual capacity, that they have not lost their emotional capacity, they are still who they are. And the fact that they only have a very limited range of language tools when we're talking about English at their disposal does not diminish them as a person. So I think, and I think this is a very, it is something that happens quite a lot, especially outside the teaching community. And it is a problem. I think, I mean, one of the ways in which I have dealt with that is by saying, I'm here, can you talk to me, but I am an extremely assertive person in some ways. So, for me, it's not a problem to say, hold on, I'm still an adult. The fact that I don't, for example, speak Swedish does not mean that I'm a child. I am an adult, and you can talk to me. You don't have to talk to the person who's standing next to me. But obviously not everybody can do it. I think one of the, when we are talking about the psychological aspect of teaching, or psychological aspect of teaching and using pronunciation, I think one of the issues, and it's definitely an issue that I have come across in my teaching and training, and also in my own learning, is that because very often it's because of the educational background that we have. We feel silly to imitate sounds which just don't sound natural or don't feel natural to us. Okay, but that's why, I mean, one of the comments that I wrote in the chat box when I was during the input session, I was demonstrating the activity with sound production, that the miming, the making of silly faces. Students feel comfortable because I'm the first one to make the silly face. So they can see that I can do it. I'm not afraid to make silly faces. So if I'm not afraid to do it in front of the whole group, then they are much less afraid to do it themselves. So I really think that, and it's probably more important when we are talking about pronunciation than it is when we're talking about grammar, vocabulary, or functional language. It does have this kind of, I don't know, psychological weight, if you like.
Can I offer something on that very technique that you were talking about? Because that you said you couldn't remember who taught you that.
No.
But I know where it came from.
Oh,
and I
tell
know
me.
where, and I know why it works. And it actually comes from Silent Way. I'm always banging on about Silent Way, for which I apologize. But it has influenced ELT. It has influenced ELT in all kinds of ways that people may not necessarily realize. Now, according to Gitenyo, and this is his thinking really, when we hear a sound which is foreign to us, what we do is search the brain for something which is close to it, right? So audio recognition, and then a cerebral search, if you want, for something which approximates what we've heard. And that results in inaccuracy, said Gaetano. But so he said, in order to short circuit that process, if we show a sound as you did for the and so on, then the brain doesn't have a chance to do that. And in fact, to add more strength to that, he said that pre-speech babies look at our faces, and this is of course perfectly true, they do, and they're looking for, unknowingly to them, but they're looking at pronunciation, really. So they're looking at how our mouth works and so on. Actually, this brings up something which I'll just throw in here because I think it's quite interesting. But with people walking around in a masked way now through COVID, I wonder what effect that is having on children's language development. But anyway, so that's where it comes from.
Okay, thank you very much for that. That's very useful. I think when we're talking about the fact that we all wear masks these days, I actually had a situation, I think it was a couple of months ago. I speak German, but my German is not as good as my English. So when I use German, I do need the help of the shape of the mouth with whatever the other person is saying. And I was in a shop in Germany, and I was talking to the lady at the checkout, and I just could not understand her. And it was basically because she was wearing a mask. So I asked her to speak up because the mask was actually muffling the sounds, but also I didn't have the extra help of the shape of the mouth. So yeah, it is very, very true.
Speaking on the telephone is also at another level. I mean, I'm fluent in Italian, but I still don't like speaking on the telephone. Yeah. Because there's something missing.
Yeah.
Can I ask you something else?
Sure.
I don't think we've got any Q&As, nothing in the Q&A box. No. This is something which happened to me a couple of years ago. I was watching a teacher, I was observing a teacher in a formal situation, and he didn't do any pronunciation work during a lesson. And afterwards I said to him, he didn't do any pronunciation work during a lesson. What's that about? Do you not feel that it's important? And he said, well, I believe it's a colonial imperialistic endeavor.
Oh, right. Okay. All right. Well,
I just wonder what.
I don't really know where to start with this. I think it kind of goes back to what I was talking about in the input session. I think, the insistence of having native English as a model and the only acceptable pronunciation, that's perhaps that's not something that I'm in favor of, let's put it this way. And it does have political connotations.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it does have political connotations.
It does. But then the whole of EFL or ELT has that, doesn't it? It's not just pronunciation which has that.
Yeah.
And I'm amazed, really. If you go back to Henry Widdowson's article on the ownership of English, and that was in, what was it, 94 or 96 or something. I mean, by now we should have got over all that nonsense, shouldn't we? And there we are, still talking about native speaker models. I mean, it's absurd.
It is absurd, but I think it ties in with this whole idea of a native speaker. I mean, first of all, who is a native speaker? Would you say I'm a native speaker? Well, theoretically, I'm not, but I am. I started learning English when I was about 10. I was born in Poland, raised in Poland, never lived in an English-speaking country, and yet I sound like somebody from the UK. Does that make me a native speaker, or does that make me a non-native speaker? And so I think this distinction into native speakers of English and non-native speakers of English, I think that's an absurd distinction. And as a non-native speaker of English, I have actually experienced quite a lot of discrimination in the industry. Which is sad. I mean, again, I am a strong person, and I have been able to have a very interesting career in EFL anyway. But there is this notion, and it's a purely economic notion in some ways, that a native speaker is a better teacher. Well, hello, you know, in what way, where, how, you know? I think we really, and I'm really happy that this discussion has started in ELT, because the discussion has started. I mean, okay, we're still a very long way from resolving that issue, but at least the discussion is happening. You know, people are talking about it, and I'm really happy about it. But you know, do we really want to talk about what my first language is, you know, what language I was speaking at home with my parents and my sisters, or do we want to talk about how good my English is and what my qualifications and experience in terms of teaching are, you know? You know, I'm a native speaker of Polish. Does that qualify me to teach Polish? Never, you know, never, ever. I wouldn't dare. I just wouldn't dare, because I don't have sufficient knowledge of Polish as a language, and I don't have sufficient knowledge of methodology of teaching this particular language. And I haven't got sufficient knowledge in terms of what difficulties different nationalities might have with Polish. I know Polish is a dead difficult language, but that's, you know, that's the extent of my knowledge about Polish, my native language. So, you know, so I'm really hoping that we are finally kind of moving in the direction of recognizing that, you know, a teacher needs to have a sufficient level of language and qualifications to teach the language, and, you know, experience, which obviously, you know, when you start your teaching career, you don't have the experience, yeah. But if you're intent on building on the knowledge that you have gained when you were qualifying as a teacher, and if you are really intent on your personal and professional development, then this is what we need, you know. And, you know, as I was saying in the input session, that a majority of learners of English in the whole world are taught by so-called non-native speaker teachers. I mean, does that make those teachers worse? Does that make the learners learn less? Well, of course not. You know, I was taught by non-native speaker teachers as well. So, you know, so I'm really, really hoping that we are kind of slowly, unfortunately, but that we are moving in towards the end of that era of differentiating between native speaker teachers and non-native speaker teachers, incling financial differentiation.
I'm afraid not.
Well,
Yeah,
you know, I'm an optimist.
I'm also an optimist, but in this particular regard, I speak to, and have for many years spoken to, teachers and school owners, in particular private school owners, and they say they bring out the old, you know, well, our students want native speakers. So my answer to that, of course, is, well, it's up to you to educate your students,
exactly.
your students and your students' parents and so on. I'm afraid it's not going to happen in my lifetime. It might in yours, I don't know. Can we move on to something else that I wanted to just?
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to give you a little prod about this one. Actually, you did the house that Jack built. And my first thought was, it's fun. I suppose it's fun, but it's not authentic. It's completely. It's not an authentic piece of language. Why not use something which is authentic? That's my first point. And second point is, why should memorize? I don't understand why they would. If you're working on sounds, we're talking about pronunciation here. If you're working that rhyme or whatever we want to call it, nursery rhyme or something. So those are my points.
Okay. Thank you. Well, first of all, no, sorry. Let me start with question number 2. Why memorize? It's not memorization on purpose, but with the repetition, and when you're working on pronunciation, repetition is actually quite useful. With the number of times that the students repeat this jazz chant, it's actually a jazz chant, you know, memorization happens. Personally, I actually happen to think that memorization is extremely useful, and I have, you know, when I was still learning English, I actually memorized a lot, and it really helped me, and I really enjoyed it. So I know that there are some students who also enjoy memorizing things. So that's one thing. The other thing is that rhythm is something that's kind of inbuilt in humans, and we generally enjoy rhythm. And rhythm helps us overcome some psychological barriers as well. So if you get students to say something that's rhythmical, it's going to be easier for them to actually say it than if you get them to say something that's not rhythmical. The authenticity versus inauthenticity issue, I never thought about it, to be quite honest. This is something that I have used, and I never questioned the issue of authenticity or inauthenticity of it. I think if you look at the sentences themselves, they seem to be fairly authentic, but I take it. I take what you said to mean that it's inauthentic, in the sense that you wouldn't actually have the whole jazz chant. You wouldn't go around saying the whole jazz chant. So that's how I understand it. But correct me if I'm wrong.
No. I mean, you're not wrong. I love jazz chants, but most of the jazz chants that I've come across or created have used language which we're likely to meet in everyday life. And it's really not difficult to create a jazz chant, what we're calling jazz chants.
Yeah.
But it's really a rhythmic dialogue, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's very easy to do that without using language which is a kind of obscure, should we say? Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
It's
this particular jazz chant is actually a cross between vocabulary and pronunciation. So I use it. So it kind of disguises. It either disguises pronunciation if you focus on the past tenses of the verbs in the jazz chant, or it disguises vocabulary if you focus on the pronunciation. And sometimes it's a good idea to disguise one using the other. But yeah, I think that's the comment that I would make about that. But yes, I agree that it would be very useful and possibly much more authentic to create jazz chants with language which, I don't know, comes up in dialogues that we exchange on every day. So yeah. Sure.
I mean, I think that from a technical point of view, pronunciation is supported by two important matters. One is context, obviously. I liked your example about a T, and I immediately thought, okay, the question depends on where you are. So the question depends on the context, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you're sitting across the table for someone who's holding a teapot and they say tea, then clearly they're asking if you want a cup of tea.
Yeah.
But if you're in a warehouse with Hessian bags everywhere, you might point to one and say tea, right? Which means something completely different.
Yeah.
So so that's, for me, is very, very important. That context is present. And in a sense, I suppose that's taking me back to Jack and his house, because there's no context there. But the other thing, which is really very important and often forgotten by teachers, is redundancy in human language. So all human languages have redundancy. So even if your pronunciation isn't fine, which is a word I'm going to use to describe rather than correct or incorrect, but rather fine, redundancy will almost always carry the message along with context, because we rarely say things once. We often have different, if you look at, for example, if I say to you, I've got 5 cars, there are 2 markers there for the plural. There's the number itself, and then there's the plural S on the end of cars. So if a big truck goes by while I'm saying 5, you'll still know that I've got a number of cars. You just won't know how many. So then you might have to ask me, how many have you got? I didn't hear that. So really my long-winded point is that pronunciation teaching needs to be supported, in my view, needs to be supported by context and the presence of redundancy.
Absolutely, yeah.
Finish.
And this is one of the points that came up in the discussion in the chat box. Yeah, that context is so important. But I think you know, when we talk about context is important no matter which kind of bit of language we're actually focusing on. Language without context doesn't really mean it. It means everything and nothing. So, but yeah, the point about redundancy is very, very important, that we actually say the same thing in a number of different ways. And so even if you don't catch one of those ways, you will catch the other ways. And so you will be able to understand the message. So yeah, context is absolutely key. There's a comment here, I think it was from Gabby, who says, I get inspired by ready activities, but I always adapt them to my students' needs and try to use authentic materials. Pragmatics. Yeah, I think this is one of the things that I would say, because one of the questions that came up in the chat box was, you know, can we talk about resources? You can, you know, there's a lot of resources for teaching pronunciation, but at the end of the day, you as the teacher who is planning a lesson or a series of lessons, you know what it is that, or a whole course, you know what it is that you're trying to achieve with your students. Sometimes you negotiate with your students what it is that you're trying to achieve, and pronunciation needs to fit into that. And you know, as with all published materials, they are never, or almost never, 100% fit for your purpose with your with this particular group of students, or with this particular individual student. So, you know, adapting to what your student or your student actually need or needs, that's absolutely key. So, you know, it's kind of difficult to talk about off-the-shelf solutions when we're teaching human beings, and every single human being is different and their needs are different, on a number of different levels. So yeah, adaptation is very, very important. Hedy, you asked about how teaching pronunciation online is different from teaching in face-to-face classrooms. From my experience, one of the most important differences is that because of the technical issues, you can't really rely on students hearing. Okay, so I think that really kind of underlines the need for moving from the auditory stimuli to the visual stimuli. Okay. So this is something that I use even more in online teaching or training than in face-to-face teaching or training, although generally speaking, I tend to rely on the visual stimuli. On the other hand, teaching online actually gives you access to certain tools that teachers may use, that teachers might encourage students to use. So for example, if you're teaching using Teams, you can actually get students to record things. There is a tool within Teams for recording stuff. So so this is something that you can exploit. But you know, when we talk about teaching online in general, teaching online versus teaching face-to-face, the pedagogical principles don't change. You know, it's the channel that changes, but the pedagogical principles don't change. You know, you still need to know what you're doing and why you're doing it, and you still need to know whether what you're doing is actually going to meet the needs of your students, again on a number of different levels. So as I was saying, you know, whether you're teaching face-to-face or online, and it doesn't matter whether you're focusing on pronunciation or anything else in the language classroom, the pedagogical principles are going to be the same. You need to take into account the limitations and the possibilities which the channel that you're using are giving, but the pedagogical principles don't change, I don't think, anyway. Can I ask you, how do you pronounce the word? I say deforestation, but yes. Oh, thanks, Steve. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think I've ever been asked that before.
Neither have I don't think. Yeah, so.
I sent you a message which was supposed to go to everybody, so I resent it to everybody. I just wanted to say that although there are lots of resources about pronunciation games and so on, that's absolutely true. But there's very, very little, apart from Adrian Underhill's brilliant sound foundations. There's very, very little which actually helps teachers to get their heads around how you do it. And so teachers have been left to kind of wander in a forest. They don't know what to do. And classically, that's one of the reasons why it hasn't been done. Mm. Can I just take a moment of everyone's time, because I'm really interested in the history of English. A couple of quotes that I'd really love to read you. I hope it doesn't bore you too much. The first one is from Harold Palmer. Harold Palmer was one of the leading lights. And in 1921, he was already promoting something which he called ear training, and that was to avoid L1 interference. So way back then, he was already thinking, how can we get students to counter L1 interference? And then J.R. Firth, who was the first chair of applied linguistics in the UK, 1937. Listen to this. This is great. The more you talk like a book, the less your pronunciation matters, right? I think that's absolutely brilliant. Then, sorry, two more. Mm-hmm. Charles Freese, 1945. The chief problem in not learning the vocabulary, the chief problem is not learning the vocabulary items, but the mastery of the sound system, right? Where has that gone? We've lost that. Last one, J.C. Catford, 1959. The student is still left to pick up some features of English without the aid of specific instruction and drill. So right, from that's over 30 years of our history there, in which main protagonists, the people who've created our history, were saying, come on guys, we've got to do something about pronunciation. And nothing really happened until 1994, actually. I hope that's interesting.
It is very interesting. So thank you very much for that. I think I would like to pick up on the quote that dealt with the avoiding L1 interference. I actually think that L1 interference is nothing wrong. I've had very interesting conversations with people who, like myself, are not native speakers of English. And in very many situations, that the fact that you have a bit of a foreign accent actually protects you, because it sends a message and it says, I'm not from here, I don't have the cultural luggage that you might have. Absolutely. So don't expect me to understand certain things. Whereas because of the way that I speak, I've actually found myself in many situations in the UK where people assume I'm from the UK. And when I say, well, I don't really understand, or I don't know that, they think that I'm, playing an idiot, basically. Yeah.
I mean, to be fair, this is a quote that goes back to 1921.
That's true, so, yeah, but I thought it was an important point to make. So.
But I completely agree with you. I mean, I'm very often taken for an Italian. And I have the same experience when somebody uses a word that I don't, particularly a technical term, which I haven't come across, and they're a bit surprised that I don't know it, because yeah,
because you're supposed to know it, yeah, yeah.
You should, yes, you should know it, yes, yeah.
But it's also the whole, the as I said, cultural luggage, you know, I don't have that cultural luggage, and yet people expect me to understand certain things without having them explained, you know, and I don't. I've never lived in the UK. I can't possibly understand certain things. So, you know, so I think, but I think that L1 interference is nothing wrong, you know. And again, I think it goes back to this idea of English as a lingua franca. You know, you're going to, or most of our students are going to communicate with people whose first language is not English, who are learners themselves, or who were learners themselves. And so, you know, we're all in the same position, really. So, and it actually, you know, my students usually say it's easier for me to understand somebody who has learned English than to understand a native speaker or proficient speaker of English. And that has to do with the complexity of language and the and again also partly with the cultural luggage, which you know, we express our culture without really thinking about it. So if English is first language for some, is the first language for somebody, they will be expressing certain culture that goes with their background without thinking about it. So yeah, so I think that's yeah, but it's again, you know, it's a point for a much longer discussion. So and I don't think we have time for that, because we're actually coming to the end of the Q&A. Claudia has asked about regional accents. There is a masterclass, Gallery Teachers Masterclass about teaching pronunciation with a regional accent. So that's something that you might be interested to watch, Claudia.